exactly what is going on.
Jesse's with me today, so what you need to do is to go back to your lab and get on with the cook. You're gonna have to muddle through this one without him, okay?
Hey everybody, and thank you for watching another video. My name is Murge, and welcome to the Breaking Bad What If series that I call the Heisenverse, a series where I make a change somewhere in the Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul timeline and explore how that one change ripples throughout the entire universe. And in this video, we talk about the idea of Mike not being shot by Joaquin Salamanca during the episode Salud, and seeing what kind of effect his presence has on the series during season 4. But before we get started, if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel, I'd appreciate it. Now, let's get into it. Walter comes to after being tased, and he finds himself on his knees with his arms zip tied behind his back with a hood over his head, and he nervously waits to be unmasked. And seconds later, Gus arrives pulling the hood off Walter, who's blinded by the sun for a few seconds before his vision focuses back in, only now to realize that he's surrounded by Gus, Mike, and Tyrus. Walter just sits there speechless, breathing heavily, because in his position, he can be killed at any moment. Gus would then address the matter of his brother-in-law, basically telling Walter, "Hey, I'm gonna kill Hank since you couldn't keep him out of my business.
Now it's left to me."
And just to avoid any potential interference from Walter, like him going to Saul to warn the DEA or him, poisoning Brock, he'd instead be detained in a safe house until the job is done and Hank Schrader is no longer an issue. So for the next 24 hours, Walter is under the supervision of Mike. And while that's going on, Jesse's in the lab finishing up a batch with Tyrus, and when Walter didn't show up to work today, as well as the DEA stopping by to search the place, he's understandably annoyed at Walter, but not enough to hate him outright. So after getting dropped off by one of Gus's men to his car on the desert road, Jesse turns on his phone and he has a bunch of missed calls and messages from Saul, telling him to just come by his office as soon as he can. Once Jesse makes it over to Saul's office, he finds a criminal lawyer panicked with Huel and Kubi talking about the issue with Ted. And after dismissing his guys, Saul tells Jesse, "Hey kid, good to see you. Now the reason I called you over here is I wanted to know if you've given any more thought to the nail salon." "Is that the reason why you called me over here? Seriously?" As he turns to head out the door. Okay, wait, it's about your partner. Have you talked to him recently?" Saul questions Jesse. "No, not since last night, and he didn't even show up to work today, and the DEA just so happened to stop by and raid us. Do you know anything about that?" Jesse explains, and hearing that Walter could be missing, Saul goes into his drawer to make a call to Mike, only to get no response. Then he calls Walter, and again, no response. He then tells Jesse, "Well, I'm pretty sure he'll turn up. I mean, he has the cancer thing along with the wife, so he has a lot of stuff going on, so I get it. But if you hear from the maestro first before I do, tell him to call me, and again, put some more thought into that nail salon business, okay?" Whatever, man. Jesse says leaving Saul's office and avoids getting pat down by Huel and keeping the rice and cigarette on his person. And he'd make a call to Mike, and unlike Saul, Mike would answer telling Jesse, "Yeah, kid." "Hey Mike, have you seen Mr. White?" Jesse questions on the phone. "Yeah, he's with me for the day." Mike says to Jesse while looking at Walter, who's zip tied to a radiator. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, just taking some precautions. In the meantime, tomorrow, we have a meeting. I'll send you the details and I want you to be there first thing in the morning. Got it?" Mike tells Jesse. "Yeah, I got it. And Mike, Gus, he isn't gonna, Jesse says, worrying for Walter's safety. "That is completely up to him. But we'll be in touch." Mike says, hanging up the phone. And while in the safe house, things between Walter and Mike get heated, with him pleading to save Hank's life, saying, "Mike, please, my brother-in-law does not have to die for what I've done. Please, if you just let me..." "No, Walter," Mike says, sternly cutting off Walter and pointing his finger. "There's nobody to blame here but you. So no matter how hard you beg or cry or try to reason with me, there's not going to change a thing. So just sit down, shut your mouth before I shut it for you." Mike finishes sitting back in his chair, and Walter remains quiet, hoping, no, praying that Hank will be okay. But in the back of his mind, he knows that Gus wasn't bluffing. And so with no other choice, Walter obeys Mike's orders, and the two wait until the next day. Over at the Schrader residence, Hank sits home alone, still recovering from the Salamanca twins' attack, so he's mostly bedbound. And during this time, Maria's out running her supposed errands because ever since Hank's been in recovery, he hasn't been in the best of moods.
Maria said Cheetos, not Fritos.
So to avoid any potential arguments, she spends her afternoon going to open houses and stealing keepsakes again. But this afternoon, because Saul never called the DEA, there wouldn't be any worry about Hank being in danger, which Gus's men used to their advantage as they visit Hank's home and easily sneak through the back. And while making their way through the house, Hank wouldn't be fast enough to react when seeing two random guys in his doorway, and 2 bullets would be fired from a silencer pistol, hitting Hank in the chest and soaking his bed sheets with his own blood. And before they leave, they make the job look like a home invasion that resulted in the death of Hank, and after slightly trashing the place, Gus's men would leave the same way they came in. And while that's going on, Maria's at an open house, and her klepto days just aren't what they used to be because she ends up getting arrested for stealing again. I don't know what it is about those spoons, but I think I have to have one now.
"I know you stole that spoon."
So after getting booked, Maria makes her one phone call to Hank, but he doesn't answer. and she's able to call again, but once again, there's no answer. Luckily for her, Detective Tim Roberts is there and he gives Hank a call, but his calls are also getting forwarded to voicemail, and Marie says, maybe Hank's at home and he needs help and that's why he's not answering, because that's very unlike Hank not to answer. Maybe you could send someone to check on him. And just as a courtesy to Marie, Tim Roberts would call Steve Gomez to check on Hank. And Gomez, who's not that far away, would arrive at Hank's house to find out that the front door's been kicked in along with papers flying out in the driveway. And he calls for backup before drawing his gun and slowly walking inside. And he calls out, Hank? Hank, can you hear me? But all he can hear is the TV that's in the other room. And he slowly approaches Hank's door and he calls out again, Hank, for the love of God, say something. And as he goes to open the door, Gomez finds Hank shot dead in his own bed with the blood now dripping from the sheets. And he quickly runs over to Hank to check his pulse, but Gomez, he's just too late. And he radios in that Hank is down and medical attention is needed. He would then take a few deep breaths before reaching out to Detective Tim Roberts to break the news to Marie. And she would completely break down in Tim's arms after hearing the news of her husband's death. And given the current circumstances, along with her relationship with the DEA, her charges will all be dropped. And instead of her going home because her house is now considered a crime scene, Skyler would be the person to pick her up from the station. But Hank's death is not easy news for anyone to handle, as even Skyler gets emotional learning about Hank's death. And almost instinctively she tries to call Walter, but in usual fashion, she gets no answer. And she also begins to worry for his safety as well, wondering if her husband would share the same fate as her brother-in-law, especially with the line of business that Walter's in, and not to mention that he's still bruised up from this fight with Jesse. But in the meantime, Skyler holds herself together for the sake of Marie, and after picking her up from the station, they would talk in her office at the car wash. Marie, you cannot blame yourself for what happened, Skyler says, comforting her sister. It is, Sky. If I wasn't... I wasn't there for him. Marie says, breaking down, as Skyler comforts her. And although nobody would likely admit it out loud, it is kind of Marie's fault if you think about it, because the fact that she was out stealing while her husband was bleeding out in his bed is the first thing that anyone would think of when they're thinking about this situation. Or at least, in my opinion. So while Skyler and Marie talk, she receives a text message from Walter that simply reads, Sorry, can't talk right now. Call you when I can. Giving her and the rest of the family some kind of reassurance that Walter is at least okay. But little does she know, that message was actually sent by Mike, and he and Walter would be headed over to the desert location to meet up with Jesse and Gus to talk about their future going forward. And once all together, it really seems that Walter has no allies in this situation, and Gus tells Walter, Your brother-in-law has been dealt with, and hearing that news causes Walter to drop to his knees crying as Gus continues. Going forward, nobody else would have to die. But to reiterate what I said yesterday, now that Jesse's here, do not come near him or the laundromat again. You're fired. Done. No longer needed. Gus says, making it clear to Walter in front of Jesse, letting it be known that it was his idea.
Pay him off or fire him. Don't kill him.
And Jesse, after hearing Gus's demands for Walter, he finds himself siding with Gus, especially given his new purpose as Mike's sidekick. He really feels that he moved beyond Mr. White, and he's a genuine part of the crew. And Jesse tells Walter, Mr. White, isn't this what you always wanted? To have enough money to take care of your family? Now you can do that and enjoy the time you have left with them, and nobody else has to die. But Walter says nothing, only glaring back at Jesse and Gus and letting out a cough. And Mike would then step in saying, Walter, you're given a one-way ticket out of here that doesn't involve you being in a box. So for the safety of you and your family, I suggest you take it. And with that, Mike gives Walter back his phone, and him, Gus, and Jesse leave Walter out in the desert, and they all go their separate ways. And once alone, Walter stands in silence for nearly 2 hours thinking back on everything that happened. And he hesitates to dial his wife's number, knowing that if he does, it'll make what Gus said about Hank real. But eventually he comes around to calling Skyler, and he's given the earth-shattering confirmation that Hank was found shot dead in his house. And Walter, holding back his emotions, knowing that Hank's death is on his hands, tells Skyler while breathing heavily, I'm sorry about Hank. And Skyler pauses for a moment, asking in a whispered tone, Walt, do you know anything about this? But Walter remains quiet on the line for a few seconds, and Skyler asks, Walt, when are you coming home? I'll be home as soon as I can, Walter says before hanging up the phone and slowly breathing in the now nighttime desert air. And as he makes his way back home driving in silence, he considers his next move. Because yeah, he can choose to follow the advice given to him by Gus, Mike, and Jesse and enjoy his retirement and what time he has left with his family, which sadly comes at the cost of accepting Hank's death as his own fault and living with that choice for the rest of his life. But this is Heisenberg we're talking about, and an attack on his family is an attack on his ego, and that's something that he refuses to let go. Even if he has to gamble his family's lives on it, there will be justice, no matter how long it takes. A few months pass and things at Walter's home are slowly coming back to normal, with the biggest change being that Marie is now living with them for the time being, and since there's no leads on Hank's murder, her best option is to stay close to family. And on the surface, things seem as fine as they can be for the White family plus one, but after the grieving sessions and doing the talking pillow thing again, behind closed doors, Skylar lies awake most nights unable to let go of the idea that Walter just might have something to do with Hank's death. But she does her best to keep a smile on her face even if it comes at the cost of her mental health as she starts back smoking up cigarettes. Because for Walter, it's obvious that something's bothering him, but he always has a convenient excuse on why he's feeling down or distracted, even when it's just him and Skylar. But inside the mind of the former meth cook, he plays through hundreds of different scenarios with him taking on Gus that all ends in him losing. And without Jesse in his corner, he has nobody that's willing to go against Gus. But as the days come and go, the thought of revenge starts to feel fruitless for Walter, especially with him coming to enjoy his time with his family on a daily basis, which is coming to be a nice change of pace compared to worried about being killed every other day. And just when the thought of turning his back on the meth business begins to feel like a real possibility, one day while leaving the cancer treatment center, Walter finds a little blue bag of meth in the parking lot. And seeing that bag, it reminds him of the legacy that was taken away from him, the one thing that he was truly good at that is no longer his. And even more insulting in his eyes is that Gus chose Jesse over him even though it was his own formula. And Walter begins to boil with anger as he steps on the bag of meth, crushing it before getting in his car. And he first heads over to the car wash to pick up the gun from out the vending machine before heading home, and he plans on a way to end this once and for all. So once the night falls, Walter's plan is to break into the lab and destroy it, not really going after Gus or Jesse, but rather the empire that could not have been there without him. So as he drives over to the laundromat, Walter's able to sneak in rather easily, but once he makes it over to the washing machine, to his surprise, he's greeted by Mike holding a gun saying, "You just couldn't stay away, could you?" Mike says, stripping the gun from Walter, and he pleads with Mike nervously putting his hands up. "Mike, please, you don't have to. How about you just follow me into the lab, Walter? Let's get this over with." Mike says, cutting off Walter, "Mike, please, that wasn't a request," Mike says in a stern tone, leading Walter to the entrance, and with the gun to his head, Walter is escorted down to the inside of the lab for the last time. And Mike simply asks, "You ready, Walter?" And he continues to beg for his life, saying, "Please, if you just let me talk to Gus." But Walter's pleas falls on deaf ears as Mike pulls the hammer back on the gun, and he fires, with Walter just saying, "No, no, 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 no." And as the blood starts to spread around the floor of the lab, Mike puts the gun down and he goes to grab the phone to call Gus, who would be miles away watching the whole thing from his laptop when his phone starts to ring, and he answers to Mike saying, "As you probably already know," Mike says looking at the camera, "Walter White will no longer be an issue." And Gus responds looking at the computer screen, "I have a few men on their way to dispose of the body and clean up the lab. Going forward, Walter White will remain missing. Permanently." And Mike says in response, "You know Pinkman's gonna have questions, right? None to which we will have answers to." Gus says in a direct response, and Mike pauses for a second before saying, "Understood." Hanging up the phone knowing that his mission going forward is similar to Howard Hamlin, but in Walter's case, his body would likely be in a barrel out in the Mexican desert. The next day passes and Skylar notices that Walter didn't come home last night, and she calls him, but like usual she gets no answer, and she just brushes it off at first, being too preoccupied with Marie and the kids, and she assumes that he'll just turn up. And so while she gets ready for her day, she receives an unexpected phone call from Saul informing her that Ted just woke up from his slip and fall accident. So while she goes to visit Ted, we pick up in the lab with Jesse and Mike, and things for the young fixer slash meth cook is going better than anyone could have expected. And being that Mike keeps him busy enough not to use, he actually becomes one of Gus's biggest assets, even able to produce up to 300 pounds a week easily. Because let's be honest here, ever since Walter started cooking for Gus, he's had excuse after excuse on why he didn't meet the quota, which was 100 pounds less.
Gail really screwed us up.
For starters, you aren't the least bit familiar with any of the equipment.
Some of the equipment wasn't calibrated correctly. Well, it's just all very technical and boring.
Meanwhile, Skylar arrives at the hospital to see Ted, who's, well, let's just say he's had better days. And after Ted gives her his word that he'll keep her secret safe, she leaves the hospital and again tries to call Walter but gets no response. And she feels her heart begin to race the same way it did when she learned of Hank's death. So as she continues to drive, being slightly distracted from her inner thoughts, her phone begins to ring, taking her eyes off the road momentarily. But that split-second decision caused her to run a red light, resulting in her being T-boned by a pickup truck. And sadly, Skylar will be airlifted to a hospital in critical condition, and things only get worse when nobody can reach Walter, putting the burden on Marie and Walter Jr. as they head over to the hospital with Holly. But once they make it to the hospital, they're given the unfortunate news that they were just too late, and Skylar didn't make it. After a few days, the news of Skylar's death and Walter's disappearance has been the topic of discussion in Albuquerque, so much so that the news has even made it over to Jesse Pinkman, who's just finding out about this now. And he thinks back nearly 2 months ago to when he last seen Walter out in the desert, and that's when Gus fired him. And if he knows his teacher like he thinks he does, then he knows that Mr. White tried to move against Gus and likely got himself killed in the process. But he knows that he won't get a straight answer from Gus, so he reaches out to Mike and the two meet up at the diner later that evening. And once together, Jesse begins the conversation getting straight to the point. Mike, I gotta know. Did Gus have Mr. White killed? And Mike is quiet for a moment, holding eye contact with Jesse before telling him. Remember back when you asked me if Gus was gonna kill Walter the day he was fired? Yeah? Jesse says, answering Mike. And my answer to you was, that depends on him. Mike says, drinking his coffee, and Jesse nods silently in agreement as he continues. This is what I'll tell you, kid. In this line of business, it's a lot like being on drugs. You get addicted. And when that's taken away from you, some people can go back to a normal life, looking back on it like a good memory. But others, like your ex-partner, they feel that if they can't have it, nobody can. And that's the kind of thinking that gets a person killed. And Jesse sits there looking at Mike, who basically given the confirmation that yes, Walter White is dead and likely killed by Mike himself, leaving Jesse apprehensive about asking Mike the question that he likely knows the answer to. So instead, Jesse asks Mike, so, what if I wanted to get out? Could I? And Mike is quiet for a moment, and then he'd say, changing the subject, let's take a drive. And while driving, Mike has a heart-to-heart with Jesse, telling him, a couple years ago, I used to be a beat cop. And on the force with me was my son, Matt. He was about your age. And at the time, I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I was a dirty cop. Most of us were. And I tried to get my son to be just like me. But he didn't want that. He was good. He wanted to go his own way. And one of my biggest regrets is not supporting him going that way. So if you ask me if you can get out, this is what I'll tell you. On the day that you're ready to quit, let me know, and I'll guarantee you a way out. And Jesse looks at Mike stunned, just taking in what he was just told, and he tells Mike genuinely, thank you, Mike. Really. Thank you. And as they continue to drive, they finally make it to their location, Madrigal Electromotive, and they have a meeting with Lydia to get Jesse his official credentials, because after all, if he's Mike's little sidekick, it's about time he had a job title to prove it. Hey everybody, and thank you so much for watching another video, and I really hope you enjoyed another story from the Heisenverse. And with this one, it's safe to say that with Mike there, Walter never stood a chance. And for Skylar, we can just call that a sort of karma for what happened to Ted if you really think about it. And I may or may not have a continuation of this video in the works coming to explore the aftermath and conclusion of this storyline, because there's still the idea of Maria and Walter Jr. who think Walter is only missing, which, yeah. And then there's the new bond between Mike and Jesse that may have them going against Gus, which makes you think, what would that look like? But that'll do it for me on this video, guys. But now I want to hear from you. What'd you think of this story? Did you like it? Does it need a part 2? Whatever it is, let me know down below in the comments and I'll do my best to respond. Until then, my name is Murge. Later.